You didn't find a deficit. You made one, then sold the cure to your donors. That wasn't a debate line. It was the opening shot in one of the most brutal exposures ever caught on congressional cameras. Stansbury didn't just bring talking points. She brought the three-stage memo. Stage 1, create the hole. Stage 2, trigger, moral panic. Stage 3, sell off the country. They called it a budget hearing. They didn't know she had the script. Stay. Stage 3 is when they take the land. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing room, casting long shadows across the mahogany tables arranged in a horseshoe formation. The air was thick with anticipation and the subtle tension that preceded political bloodshed. Representatives shuffled papers, adjusted microphones, and exchanged knowing glances, all aware that today's budget hearing would be anything but routine. Melanie Stansbury sat at her designated seat, her fingers drumming silently against a manila folder that seemed to pulse with hidden power. The New Mexico Congresswoman's usually warm demeanor had been replaced by something sharper, more focused. Her dark eyes scanned the room, taking inventory of her adversaries with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Across from her, the GOP budget bloc had arranged themselves like a fortress wall. Representative Marcus Caldwell, the committee's ranking Republican member, wore his signature Navy suit and flag pin with the confidence of a man who believed his cause was righteous. To his left sat Jennifer Walsh from Texas, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her briefing materials organized with military precision. The others, Thompson from Georgia, Rodriguez from Florida, Peterson from Ohio, formed a united front of fiscal conservatism and moral certainty. Chairman David Liu called the session to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. This morning we convened to examine the proposed Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth Act, which aims to address our nation's mounting deficit through comprehensive budget reforms. The phrase fiscal responsibility hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, sacred and unquestionable. Caldwell leaned into his microphone, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had delivered the speech countless times before. Mr. Chairman, America faces a crisis of fiscal irresponsibility. Our deficit has ballooned beyond sustainable levels, threatening the very foundation of our economic stability. The legislation before us today represents tough but necessary choices, difficult decisions that prioritize our nation's long-term health over short-term political convenience. He gestured toward a chart displaying the national debt in stark red numbers. We can no longer afford to ignore mathematics for the sake of political theater. Every dollar we spend today is a dollar stolen from our children's future. The other Republican members nodded in solemn agreement, their faces bearing expressions of reluctant but necessary resolve. They were fiscal warriors fighting the good fight against governmental excess. Stansbury's pen tapped once against her folder, then twice, a rhythm that matched her accelerating heartbeat. Representative Caldwell. She began, her voice deceptively calm. You mentioned mathematics. Let's examine some numbers, shall we? She opened her folder just enough to glimpse the documents inside pages that seemed to glow with dangerous knowledge. Your proposed legislation extends the 2017 tax cuts for another decade. Those cuts, which primarily benefit the highest earners, represent approximately $7 trillion in foregone revenue over that period. Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The tax cuts stimulate economic growth, which increases overall revenue. $7 trillion! Stansbury repeated, her voice gaining strength. That's not an opinion or an economic theory. That's the Congressional Budget Office's own projection. $7 trillion in tax cuts, primarily benefiting households earning over $400,000 annually. She paused, letting the number settle like dust after an explosion. Meanwhile, your legislation proposes cutting Medicaid by $800 billion over the same period, food assistance programs by $300 billion, environmental protection by $200 billion. Her eyes moved methodically across the Republican side of the table. Curious mathematics, wouldn't you say $7 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy over $1 trillion in cuts to programs serving the most vulnerable? Walsh leaned forward, her voice sharp with practiced indignation. Representative Stansbury, you're presenting a false choice. We're not cutting programs to fund tax cuts. We're reducing unsustainable spending that our nation simply cannot afford. Cannot afford. Stansbury's eyebrows arched. Or will not afford. Because from where I sit, it appears we can afford $7 trillion for those who need it least, but we cannot afford $1 trillion for those who need it most. The tension in the room shifted, became more electric. Several Democratic members straightened in their seats, sensing that Stansbury was building towards something larger than routine budget criticism. Caldwell's face reddened slightly. Representative, with respect, your characterization is deeply misleading. These are responsible fiscal policies designed to grow the economy and reduce our unsustainable deficit. Unsustainable. Stansbury repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something bitter. Interesting choice of words, Representative Caldwell, because I've been wondering, when exactly did our deficit become unsustainable? Was it during the previous administration, when your party voted unanimously for tax cuts that added trillions to the debt? Or did it become unsustainable only when we started discussing investments in healthcare, education, and environmental protection? The camera operators in the gallery sensed the shift in energy, their lenses focusing more tightly on the key players. This was no longer a routine budget hearing. This was becoming a confrontation. The deficit has been a long-term concern that requires long-term solutions. Peterson interjected, his Ohio accent thick with manufactured reasonableness. No one is questioning the need for social programs, but we must prioritize fiscal sustainability. Fiscal sustainability, Stansbury echoed. Another interesting phrase. Tell me, Representative Peterson, how is it fiscally sustainable to reduce revenue by $7 trillion while simultaneously claiming we need to cut spending by over $1 trillion? That's not fiscal sustainability. That's fiscal engineering. She opened her folder wider, revealing the corner of a document marked with the distinctive letterhead of a consulting firm. Several Republican members glanced at each other with barely concealed unease. You see, I've been doing some research into the origins of this legislation, and I've discovered something quite fascinating about the timeline of fiscal concern versus fiscal generosity. Caldwell's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on his pen. Representative Stansbury, if you have a specific question about the legislation, Oh, I have many questions, Representative Caldwell, starting with this one: who benefits when we create a $7 trillion hole in our budget, then declare a fiscal emergency that requires cutting aid to the poor? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. The Republican members sat in stunned silence, not because they didn't have an answer, but because they suddenly realized that Stansbury might already know it. In the gallery, reporters leaned forward in their seats. The C-SPAN cameras continued their steady documentation, unaware they were capturing the opening salvo of what would become a political earthquake. Stansbury closed her folder gently, but her eyes remained fixed on her Republican colleagues with laser intensity. Because that's what we're really discussing here, isn't it? Not fiscal responsibility, but fiscal redistribution. 7 trillion up, 1 trillion down. The largest upward transfer of wealth in American history disguised as budget reform. The hearing room's atmosphere had transformed from professional courtesy to barely contained warfare. The morning light seemed harsher now, throwing stark shadows that divided the room into territories of conflict. Stansbury's words had landed like artillery shells, and the GOP members were scrambling to rebuild their defensive positions. Chairman Liu attempted to restore order. Representative Stansbury, if you could focus your questions on specific provisions of the legislation. Actually, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to focus on the methodology behind these provisions. Stansbury's voice carried a new edge, the sound of someone who had moved beyond mere questioning into active prosecution. Representative Walsh, you mentioned that Medicaid cuts are unavoidable due to fiscal constraints. I'm curious about the timing of this discovery. Walsh's prepared talking points seemed to crumble in her mouth. I'm not sure I understand the question. When did you first become aware that Medicaid was fiscally unsustainable? Was it before or after the decision to extend $7 trillion in tax cuts? The two issues are separate. Are they? Stansbury leaned forward, her intensity palpable. Because from a purely mathematical perspective, it seems remarkably convenient that our deficit crisis emerged precisely when social programs needed funding, but not when tax cuts needed extending. She opened her folder again, this time extracting a single sheet of paper, with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. In fact, I've discovered something quite remarkable about the timeline of fiscal concern in this committee. The paper in her hand seemed to glow with dangerous potential. Several Republican members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on the document like prey watching a predator. This is a memo. Stansbury continued, her voice gaining momentum, obtained through proper congressional oversight channels. It outlines a three-stage strategic approach to budget reform. Stage 1 is titled... She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes scanning the room. Create the hole. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sounds were the gentle hum of HVAC systems and the soft clicking of camera shutters in the press gallery. Stage 1. She read from the document, consists of implementing substantial tax reductions targeting high-income brackets with particular emphasis on corporate and investment income. The resulting deficit increase will provide justification for subsequent fiscal reform measures. Caldwell's face had gone ashen. Representative Stansbury, I object to the introduction of uncorroborated documents. Oh, this is fully corroborated, Representative Caldwell. In fact, it's corroborated by your own voting record. Her smile was sharp as a blade. Every tax cut vote, every deficit expansion, every piece of legislation that dug us deeper into fiscal crisis, it's all here in black and white, part of stage one of a comprehensive strategy. She turned the page with theatrical precision, but stage one was just the beginning. Stage two is far more interesting. It's titled Trigger Moral Panic Around Entitlement Spending. The words hit the Republican side of the table like a physical blow. Walsh actually recoiled slightly, her carefully maintained composure cracking. Stage 2. Stansbury continued reading. Involves leveraging the deficit created in Stage 1 to justify comprehensive reductions in social programs. Key messaging should emphasize fiscal responsibility, generational theft, and unsustainable spending patterns. The goal is to reframe essential social programs as luxury expenditures that responsible governance cannot afford. Thompson from Georgia found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. That document, where did it originate? Who authored it? An excellent question, Representative Thompson. One I plan to answer fully. Stansbury's eyes glittered with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. But first, let me share Stage 2's recommended tactics. She cleared her throat and continued reading. Create urgency through repeated emphasis on fiscal crisis. Utilize emotional language regarding debt burden on future generations. Frame program cuts as painful but necessary medicine. Emphasize that delay will only make eventual cuts more severe. The accuracy of the description was devastating. Every talking point, every rhetorical strategy, every emotional appeal the Republican members had used in the past hour was laid out in the memo like a playbook for manipulation. This document, Walsh said, her voice strained, appears to be speculative strategy discussion, not official policy. Does it? Stansbury's eyebrows rose in mock surprise, because it seems remarkably predictive of actual legislative priorities. $7 trillion in tax cuts creating unprecedented deficits, followed immediately by declarations of fiscal crisis requiring cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, environmental protection, exactly as outlined in Stage 2. She leaned back in her chair, the document still in her hands like a weapon she wasn't finished using. But here's what I find most fascinating about Stage 2. It's not actually about fiscal responsibility at all. It's about psychological manipulation. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of people realizing they were witnessing something historic, the moment when political theater becomes political revelation. The memo explicitly states, Stansbury continued, that the goal is to trigger moral panic, not fiscal analysis, not economic evaluation, moral panic, the systematic manipulation of public fear to achieve predetermined policy outcomes. She looked directly at Caldwell, her gaze unwavering. Representative Caldwell, when you spoke about dollars stolen from our children's future, were you following Stage 2's recommended messaging strategy? Caldwell's mouth opened and closed without sound. The question was unanswerable without either admitting manipulation or denying the accuracy of his own words. When Representative Walsh emphasized painful but necessary medicine, was that Stage 2 guidance Walsh stared at the table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When Representative Thompson discussed unsustainable spending was that Stage 2 framing. The methodical destruction was surgical in its precision. Each question revealed another layer of calculated manipulation, another instance where moral rhetoric had been deployed as a weapon of fiscal policy. Peterson finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Representative Stansbury, regardless of the source of that document, the fiscal realities remain unchanged. Do they? Stansbury's voice rose sharply. Because according to this memo, the fiscal realities were manufactured. Stage 1 created the crisis. Stage 2 weaponized the panic. The entire premise of your legislation, fiscal necessity, was engineered to achieve a predetermined outcome. She held up the document, letting it catch the light. This isn't budget policy, representatives. This is budget theater. A carefully orchestrated performance designed to transfer wealth from the bottom to the top while disguising the transfer as fiscal responsibility. The press gallery erupted in whispered conversations and rapid note-taking. The C-SPAN cameras continued their steady documentation, capturing what was becoming a pivotal moment in congressional history. But we're not done yet, Stansbury said, her voice cutting through the rising murmur of voices. Because Stage 2 was just the setup. The real revelation is in Stage 3. The hearing room had become a gladiatorial arena, with Stansbury wielding truth like a sword and the GOP members huddled behind increasingly inadequate shields of denial. The morning sun had moved higher, casting different shadows that seemed to rearrange the very geometry of power in the room. Stansbury reached into her folder again, this time extracting a larger document bound with a black clip. The movement was deliberate, theatrical. She had learned that in moments like these, presentation was as important as content. Stage 3. She announced, letting the words carry across the room like a judge pronouncing sentence. This is where your legislation becomes truly remarkable in its audacity. She opened the bound document, revealing what appeared to be maps, charts, and detailed financial projections. The Republican members leaned forward, despite themselves trying to discern what new ammunition Stansbury had discovered. Stage 3 is titled Reclaim the Land. And it's here that your fiscal responsibility mask finally slips completely. Representative Rodriguez from Florida, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. Representative Stansbury, I fail to see how land policy relates to budget discussions. Don't you? Her smile was predatory. Then let me enlighten you. According to your own legislation, 47% of the deficit reduction comes not from spending cuts, but from increased revenue. Specifically, revenue from expanded resource extraction on public lands. She turned the document around, displaying a detailed map of the American West marked with colored zones and extraction projections. 237 million acres of currently protected federal land would be opened for mining, drilling, and logging operations. The projected revenue over 10 years, $1.4 trillion. The map was devastating in its scope and clarity. Vast swaths of national forest, wildlife preserves, and protected wilderness areas were marked for industrial exploitation. The visual impact was immediate and undeniable. Representative Rodriguez, Stansbury continued, your state of Florida shows 43 new offshore drilling zones. Representative Thompson, Georgia, shows expanded clear-cutting permits across 6 national forests. Representative Peterson, Ohio, shows fracking authorizations in areas currently protected under the Clean Water Act. She moved systematically through the map, calling out specific locations with the precision of someone reading from a detailed intelligence briefing. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow. But here's the truly remarkable part. She continued, turning to another page of charts. These aren't emergency measures driven by fiscal necessity. According to the Stage 3 documentation, this has been the goal from the beginning. Walsh finally found her voice, though it came out strained and defensive. Environmental policy and fiscal policy are separate issues. Are they? Stansbury's eyebrows arched in mock surprise. Because according to this internal analysis, the environmental rollbacks were always the primary objective. The tax cuts created the justification, the social program cuts provided political cover, but the real prize was always the land. She held up another sheet from the bound document. Stage 3 explicitly states that the goal is to reclaim federal assets for productive use while reducing regulatory burden on key economic sectors. Translation: sell off America's natural heritage to the highest bidder while calling it budget reform. The room erupted in hushed conversations as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about tax policy or social programs. This was about a comprehensive restructuring of America's relationship with its own natural resources. Caldwell attempted to regain control. Representative Stansbury, you're conflating multiple policy initiatives. Am I? She held up the bound document like a Bible. Because this comprehensive analysis shows remarkable coordination between tax policy spending cuts and environmental deregulation. Almost as if they were part of a single integrated strategy. She flipped to a page dense with financial projections. The math is actually quite elegant. $7 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy, $1 trillion in program cuts for the poor, $1.4 trillion in revenue from selling public lands to corporate interests. The numbers balance perfectly as long as you don't mind liquidating America's natural heritage to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. Thompson finally exploded. That's a gross mischaracterization of responsible resource management. Responsible. Stansbury's voice rose sharply. Representative Thompson, your own state would lose federal protection for over 30,000 acres of Chattahoochee National Forest. Areas that have been protected since the 1930s would be open for clear-cutting operations. How is that responsible? She turned to another page, this one showing detailed extraction projections. The Cumberland Gap Mammoth Cave National Park, parts of the Great Smoky Mountains, all targeted for resource optimization under Stage 3 guidelines. The specificity was crushing. These weren't abstract policy discussions, but detailed plans for dismantling nearly a century of conservation efforts. And the timeline, Stansbury continued, her voice gaining momentum, is remarkably aggressive. Land transfers begin within 18 months of legislative passage. Environmental impact studies are streamlined to 90-day reviews. Local community input is classified as advisory only. She looked up from the document, her eyes scanning the Republican members with prosecutorial intensity. This isn't fiscal policy. This is asset stripping on a national scale. Peterson attempted a counterattack. Those lands can generate revenue while maintaining appropriate environmental protections. Can they? Stansbury flipped to another section of the document. Because the Stage 3 projections assume maximum extraction with minimal regulatory oversight. The revenue numbers only work if environmental protections are essentially eliminated. She read directly from the page. Regulatory streamlining should prioritize resource access over environmental review processes. Traditional conservation restrictions must be reframed as regulatory barriers to economic growth. The language was damning in its clinical precision. Environmental protection wasn't being balanced against economic needs. It was being systematically eliminated under the guise of fiscal necessity. But perhaps most revealing, Stansbury continued, is the section on public relations strategy. Stage 3 recommends framing environmental rollbacks as economic necessity, temporary measures to address fiscal crisis and job creation initiatives for rural communities. She looked directly at the Republican members. Every talking point you've used to defend these policies is outlined in this document as deliberate messaging strategy. The jobs argument, the economic necessity argument, the temporary measures argument, all of it is scripted political theater. The silence that followed was profound. The Republican members sat in stunned recognition that their own words were being quoted back to them as evidence of manipulation. So let me ask you directly. Stansbury said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Is this legislation about fiscal responsibility? Or is it about using manufactured fiscal crisis to achieve the largest transfer of public assets to private interest in American history? No one answered. No one could answer without either admitting the manipulation or denying the evidence of their own documented strategy. In the press gallery, reporters were frantically typing, realizing they were witnessing not just a political confrontation, but a fundamental exposure of how modern policy manipulation actually works. The C-SPAN cameras continued their steady documentation, capturing what would become one of the most replayed moments in congressional history. Stansbury closed the bound document gently, but her eyes remained fixed on her Republican colleagues with laser intensity. Because if it's the latter, if this is all political theater designed to justify asset stripping, then we need to have a very different conversation about whose interests this legislation actually serves. The hearing room had become a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension and the electric anticipation that precedes a complete political detonation. Stansbury sat with the quiet confidence of someone holding royal flush, while the Republican members appeared increasingly like players who had just realized they were in a game whose rules they had never fully understood. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows had shifted, casting longer shadows that seemed to divide the room into territories of truth and deception. In the press gallery, reporters sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just political theater, but the systematic dismantling of a carefully constructed facade. Stansbury reached into her folder one final time, extracting a thick document bound in an official blue cover. The weight of it in her hands seemed to represent the gravity of what she was about to reveal. Representatives. She began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved beyond questioning into final judgment. I've shared with you stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 of what I've been calling your strategic approach to budget reform. But what I haven't shared is the complete document, the full scope of what was planned from the very beginning. She held up the blue-bound document like a prosecutor presenting key evidence. This is the complete 3-stage memo obtained through proper congressional oversight. It's not a speculative strategy paper or a theoretical discussion. It's a comprehensive blueprint for the systematic manipulation of American fiscal policy. The Republican members sat frozen, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that whatever defensive strategies they had prepared were about to prove inadequate. The complete memo, Stansbury continued, was commissioned 18 months ago by an organization calling itself Americans for Tax Fairness. Though, as we'll discover, the name is perhaps the most ironic aspect of this entire affair. She opened the document to its title page, displaying it for the cameras. The full title is a 3-stage strategic framework for comprehensive fiscal reform and asset optimization, authored by Morrison Strategic Consulting and funded by... She paused, letting the suspense build. Well, that's the truly fascinating part. Walsh leaned forward, her voice tight with apprehension. Representative Stansbury, the source of funding for private consulting, is a matter of public record. When it involves congressional legislation, Stansbury cut her off smoothly. And in this case, the funding sources are quite illuminating. She turned to a page near the back of the document. The 3-stage memo was funded by a consortium of organizations: the Freedom Foundation, the Economic Growth Alliance, Americans for Prosperity Action, and the Constitutional Rights Defense Fund. Combined funding, $12.7 million. The numbers hung in the air like accusation and evidence combined. But here's where it gets interesting. Stansbury continued, her voice gaining energy. These aren't grassroots organizations concerned about fiscal responsibility. They're pass-through entities funded by a remarkably small group of ultra-wealthy individuals and corporations. She held up another sheet of paper. The Freedom Foundation's largest donors include 3 billionaire families whose combined wealth exceeds $200 billion. The Economic Growth Alliance is funded primarily by fossil fuel companies that would directly benefit from Stage 3 land transfers. Americans for Prosperity Action is funded by, well, I think we all know that one. The implications were staggering. The entire legislative framework wasn't the product of congressional deliberation or constituent pressure. It was commissioned political product designed by and for a handful of ultra-wealthy interests. So let me walk through what actually happened here. Stansbury said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a closing argument. $12.7 million was spent to develop a strategy for transferring $7 trillion in tax benefits to the wealthy, cutting $1 trillion in programs for the poor, and generating $1.4 trillion in revenue by selling off America's natural heritage. She looked up from the document, her eyes scanning each Republican member in turn. The return on investment is quite remarkable. $12.7 million invested to generate $8.4 trillion in benefits for the investor class. That's a return of over 60,000%. Caldwell finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and defensive. Representative Stansbury, you're implying coordination that doesn't exist? Am I implying it? She opened the document to a section marked with bright yellow tabs, because the memo is quite explicit about coordination requirements. She began reading from the highlighted sections. Quote, "Successful implementation requires coordinated messaging across legislative, media, and advocacy channels. Key congressional allies should receive talking points, materials, and strategic briefings prior to committee hearings. Public statements should emphasize fiscal necessity while avoiding detailed discussion of revenue sources or beneficiary analysis." The accuracy was devastating. Every aspect of the Republican member's presentation that morning had been scripted in advance, down to the specific talking points and rhetorical strategies. But perhaps most revealing, Stansbury continued, is the section on timeline coordination. She flipped to another tabbed section. The memo recommends introducing tax cut extensions, first followed by deficit concerns, followed by spending cut proposals, followed by environmental deregulation, in precisely that sequence to maximize public acceptance of each stage. She looked up from the document. And that's exactly what happened, isn't it? The tax cuts came first presented as economic stimulus, then the deficit concerns presented as fiscal responsibility, then the spending cuts presented as necessary medicine, and finally the environmental rollbacks presented as temporary revenue measures. The chronological precision was undeniable. The legislative sequence had followed the memo's recommendations with clockwork accuracy. So now we come to the real question. Stansbury said, closing the document and placing it carefully on the table. Was this legislation developed through democratic deliberation, or was it purchased by ultra-wealthy interests and marketed as fiscal responsibility? The silence that followed was profound and damning. The Republican members sat in stunned recognition that their entire political framework had been exposed as manufactured product. Thompson attempted one final defense. Even if outside groups provided analysis, the policy merits remain. Do they? Stansbury's interruption was sharp and immediate. Because according to the memo's own analysis, the policies only make sense if you ignore their actual impacts on real people. She opened the document to its final section. The memo includes a detailed impact analysis that they recommend keeping confidential. 23 million Americans would lose Medicaid coverage. 14 million would lose food assistance. 3.7 million would lose housing support, and that's just in the first 5 years. The human cost laid out in clinical precision was staggering. But for the memo's funders, she continued, the benefits are equally precise. The wealthiest 1% would receive an average tax benefit of $470,000 annually. The largest corporations would see regulatory costs reduced by an estimated $90 billion annually. And the fossil fuel industry would gain access to resources valued at over $800 billion. She closed the document with finality. So let me ask you, one final time, representatives, is this legislation about fiscal responsibility? Or is it about using the machinery of government to facilitate the largest upward transfer of wealth in American history? The question hung in the air like a judge's sentence. In the press gallery, the sound of rapid typing had become a percussion soundtrack to political revelation. The C-SPAN cameras continued their steady documentation, capturing what would become a watershed moment in American political discourse. The Republican members sat in silence not because they couldn't answer, but because any answer would either confirm the manipulation or contradict the evidence of their own documented strategy. The hearing room had transformed into something resembling a courtroom after a verdict, the air heavy with the weight of revealed truth and the silence of the condemned. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows at sharp angles, casting the chamber in stark light and deep shadows that seemed to underscore the moral clarity of what had just transpired. Stansbury sat quietly for a long moment, allowing the implications of her revelation to settle like dust after an explosion. The blue-bound document lay before her like evidence presented to a jury, its contents having systematically dismantled not just a piece of legislation, but an entire apparatus of political deception. The Republican members remained frozen in various poses of defeat, Caldwell staring at his hands, Walsh gazing at the ceiling as if seeking divine intervention, Thompson slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft clicking of camera shutters and the barely audible whisper of reporters taking notes in the gallery. Finally, Stansbury spoke, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had completed a difficult but necessary task. Let me be absolutely clear about what we've learned today. She began, her words measured and deliberate. This legislation, this entire framework of fiscal responsibility, was not developed through democratic deliberation or constituent pressure or even ideological conviction. It was purchased. $12.7 million spent to engineer $8.4 trillion in wealth transfer. She gestured toward the document. Every talking point, every emotional appeal, every moral argument we've heard today was scripted in advance by paid consultants working for ultra-wealthy clients. The deficit crisis was manufactured. The fiscal emergency was fabricated. The moral panic around social spending was deliberately triggered. Her voice began to rise, not with anger, but with the kind of moral clarity that comes from seeing through elaborate deception to simple truth. You gave $7 trillion to the rich, then blamed the poor for the hole you dug. You engineered a fiscal crisis, then used it to justify cutting medicine for diabetics, food for hungry children, and housing for homeless veterans. You manufactured moral panic around helping the vulnerable while quietly arranging the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history. The words hit like physical blows. Each sentence stripped away another layer of political rhetoric to expose the raw mechanics of power and manipulation underneath. This isn't budgeting. Stansbury continued, her voice gaining strength. This is betrayal. Betrayal of democratic process, betrayal of fiscal honesty, betrayal of the fundamental promise that government should serve all its people, not just those wealthy enough to purchase legislative outcomes. She stood slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. The gesture was theatrical, but also deeply symbolic, the moment when someone refuses to remain seated in the face of systematic injustice. Representative Caldwell, when you spoke about dollars stolen from our children's future, you were reading from a script written by people who plan to steal their present. Representative Walsh, when you discuss painful but necessary medicine, you were administering poison prescribed by people who profit from the sickness. Representative Thompson, when you defended responsible resource management, you were rationalizing the liquidation of America's natural heritage for private gain. The personal indictments were devastating in their precision. Each Republican member was forced to confront not just their policy positions, but their role as unwitting actors in someone else's drama. But perhaps most tragically, Stansbury continued, her voice taking on a note of genuine sadness. You've allowed yourselves to become the public face of policies that serve interests fundamentally opposed to the people who elected you. Your constituents will lose health care, lose food assistance, lose environmental protection, while your legislation's actual beneficiaries will gain tax cuts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. She picked up the blue document one final time, holding it like evidence of crime. This memo proves that you've been manipulated as surely as the American people have been manipulated. The difference is that you had access to the truth and chose to ignore it. You had the power to represent your constituents' interests and chose to serve someone else's agenda instead. The moral weight of the accusation was crushing. The Republican members weren't just revealed as wrong, they were revealed as complicit in their own manipulation. So, I'll ask you one final question. Stansbury said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Whose budget is this? Is it America's budget designed to serve America's interests, or is it the budget of a handful of ultra-wealthy individuals who spent $12.7 million to purchase legislative outcomes worth trillions? She paused, letting the question hang in the air like a final judgment. Because if it's the latter, if this is purchase policy masquerading as democratic governance, then we need to acknowledge that we're not really having a budget debate at all. We're watching a performance scripted by people who will never face the consequences of the policies they've designed. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This wasn't the silence of people searching for answers or preparing responses. This was the silence of people confronting uncomfortable truths about systems they had chosen to participate in. In the press gallery, reporters sat transfixed, realizing they had witnessed not just political confrontation, but a fundamental challenge to the nature of democratic governance itself. The C-SPAN cameras continued their steady documentation, capturing what would become one of the most replayed and analyzed moments in congressional history. Stansbury gathered her material slowly, deliberately, her movements carrying the weight of someone who had completed a necessary but exhausting task. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a young Democratic representative in the back row, someone newly elected, still carrying the idealism that experience hadn't yet weathered. The young representative reached for the extra copy of the memo that Stansbury had left on the table, her eyes wide with the recognition of someone seeing the political system's true machinery for the first time. The question now, Stansbury said, her voice carrying across the room one final time, is what we do with this knowledge. Do we continue to pretend that purchase policy is democratic governance, or do we finally acknowledge that our budget reflects not our values, but the values of those wealthy enough to buy them? She walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence of the chamber. At the doorway, she turned back one final time. $7 trillion for the rich. 1 trillion cut from the poor, 1.4 trillion from selling America's natural heritage, 12.7 million spent to make it all seem reasonable. Her voice carried a note of finality. That's not fiscal policy. That's fiscal colonialism, the systematic exploitation of democratic processes to serve elite interests. As she disappeared,